finally, thanks to all of you for being here. And why are you here?
I can't say that I know for sure, but I think you're here. I think we're all here because we know, we believe, we feel that foundations matter, and that foundation effectiveness matters. That we feel that foundations can do things, notwithstanding all of the hype about market-based solutions to everything that we seem to be hearing, that foundations can do things that other actors in our society cannot or will not. That they can take on the very toughest challenges, challenges that are on far too vivid display here in Detroit. Challenges like the ones Carol alluded to. Gun violence that takes far too many lives. An education system that's not serving all the kids. Deeply entrenched poverty, persistent joblessness, an exodus of industrial jobs that seems unrelenting. The legacy of racism and discrimination. Environmental destruction. These are the challenges that the markets and government haven't solved. That's why there's still problems, right? And that's why we need foundations to be effective in their work against those challenges. And as I've said many times to many of you, because this work is so difficult, gauging progress is especially difficult. There isn't an easy analog to profitability or ROI. There is no universal impact measure by which we can compare results of program A to program B. Knowing how you're doing in pursuit of your goals is really difficult. It makes your jobs harder. And that's one of the things that CEP is really focused on. And we studied performance assessment right out of the gates at the beginning 12 years ago, and we looked again at the issue a couple years back and said, has there been change with respect to foundation performance assessment? And we saw that, in fact, foundation CEOs thought that progress had been made and were tapping into more different kinds of data sources to assess performance than had been the case a decade before. We talked about that in Boston for those of you who attended that conference and put out a research report about it. And that's good. Foundations are doing more to assess and improve. But the question remains, what does it all add up to? How much progress is really being made toward these very difficult and vexing goals? And guess what? I don't have the answer. I mean, there is no way to definitively know, and there isn't any way to definitively know what foundations' contributions have been either. But I think it's important to try to understand to the best of our ability what foundation leaders think about these questions so we know where we are and where we need to go as a field, to the extent that we're a field. So do CEOs feel that progress is being made toward these goals? Do they feel their foundations are contributing? What are the barriers? What's enabling progress when it's happening? So these are some of the questions that we posed in a survey earlier this year, and many of you responded, and we thank you for doing that. And as we developed the survey, we got some feedback like, how useful is this going to be? You're asking foundation CEOs to gauge their own progress toward goals? Like, come on, why bother? Everybody's going to say they're doing great. We all overestimate our abilities in everything, right? And research even shows that this is true. So don't bother. But I wasn't sure if that was true. I thought maybe foundation leaders would be their own toughest critics, perched as they are in the unique position to understand all the ways in which their foundations aren't fully living up to their potential and their commitment to make as much of a difference as they can with the resources that they have. Maybe that would be what we would see in our survey results. Or maybe foundation leaders would be positive on their contributions, and for good reason. Because for all the hand-wringing about philanthropy, and I think we do a lot of hand-wringing about philanthropy, I believe that if you look behind the curtain at some of the progress that's been made in our society, you can often find foundations, not alone, but effective foundations behind that curtain. I have been in a lot of foundation offices and boardrooms over the last 12 years, arguably too many. And I've seen foundations justifiably proud, celebrating environmental victories even amid too many setbacks, celebrating progress in gay rights, marriage equality, end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, celebrating increased access to health care. But I've also seen foundation boards whose members shake their head in puzzlement, if not disgust, unable to answer the question, what contribution have we made? And unsure whether any of the tens of millions of dollars for which they've been responsible has really been put to good use. Seen both. So we wanted to just understand, what is the CEO perspective on progress? Knowing how you all, how foundation leaders see your own contribution, as well as the contribution of foundations in general, I think provides an important frame for our work in terms of what we need to focus on at CEP, and I hope for the next day and a half. So thanks for being here, and I'm going to turn it over now to CEP's Vice President for Research, Ellie Buteau, who's going to share with all of you what we learned from the survey that I discussed. Thank you.
So, what is the story? What's really going on when it comes to the progress foundations are making toward important goals? To find out, we surveyed the almost 500 full-time CEOs of foundations giving at least $5 million in grants annually. 211 responded for a 45% response rate. As Phil mentioned, the goals of this survey were to understand what progress foundations have made, what's getting in the way of progress, and what might enable even more progress to be made. So what did we learn? We asked CEOs to share with us the goal toward which their foundation is devoting the most of its resources. 40% of CEOs shared with us a goal about education, 19% about health, and the remaining 41% shared goals focused on other issue areas, including 7% focused on health and 4% focused on arts and culture. Well, do CEOs believe that substantial progress is being made toward these important goals? Well, not really. The majority of CEOs, when we asked, how much progress do you believe has been made to date collectively by the various organizations working toward the same key goal as your organization, believe that only moderate progress has been made. 25% believe a lot of progress has been made, and almost the same percent believe only a little progress has been made. When we ask CEOs about the contribution their foundation has made to progress, that's a different story. 60% of CEOs believe their foundation has contributed a lot to the progress that's been made. Well, what's getting in the way of even more progress being made? What are some of the barriers to progress? On the survey, we asked CEOs to rate the extent to which 15 potential barriers were getting in the way of their foundation's progress. And the greatest perceived barriers to progress exist outside foundations. Government policy was cited by 76% of CEOs as being at least somewhat, if not a significant, barrier to progress. The current economic climate was also cited by 76%. But what about barriers that are more internal to foundations? What's getting in the way that's more under the control of foundation leaders? Essentially, CEOs said there was hardly anything getting in the way of their progress that was under their control. A minority of CEOs said that their foundation's capacity to provide non-monetary assistance, or a lack of agreement with their board about the best strategies to use, or a shortage of relevant staff expertise was even somewhat of a barrier to progress. Stepping away from barriers, what might enable more progress to be made? What might lead to greater foundation impact? On the survey, we listed a series of practices, and we were curious to understand CEOs' sense of the promise these practices hold for increasing foundation impact broadly, as well as whether or not their own foundation engaged in each of these practices. A minority of CEOs believe that sunsetting, or foundations spending themselves out of existence, could significantly or extremely increase the impact foundations are having. And less than half of CEOs believe that impact investing could. Even fewer CEOs report that their foundations are engaging in these practices. Only 13% said their foundation plans to sunset, and 35% said their foundation engages in impact investing. But there were practices that CEOs believe hold great promise for increasing foundation impact. Scaling successful programs or organizations, supporting nonprofits in their efforts to assess their performance, working with organizations across sectors toward a shared goal, and working with other foundations toward a shared goal. What would it take for foundations to engage in these practices that CEOs believe hold so much promise for impact? Apparently not very much, because most CEOs overwhelmingly said that their foundations are already engaging in these practices. For each of these practices, at least 70% of CEOs said their foundation was already doing this. So it seems that CEOs believe their own foundations are contributing a lot to the progress that's being made. Not much that's standing in the way is under their control, and they're already engaging in the practices that they believe could lead to greater foundation impact. And that leads us to wonder, how well do CEOs understand the impact foundations are having, their own foundations as well as others? So we asked the extent to which CEOs agreed or disagreed that compared to a decade ago, my foundation has made progress in being able to understand its impact. Almost half of CEOs, 45%, used the highest rating on the scale, saying they strongly agreed that compared to a decade ago, their foundation has made progress in being able to understand its impact. But when we ask the same question about foundations broadly, only 14% of CEOs use the highest rating on the scale, saying they strongly agree that compared to a decade ago, foundations have made progress in being able to understand their impact. So we see a disconnect again here between how foundation CEOs are viewing how things are going at their own foundation and how they see things going elsewhere. So are we seeing the dynamic that Phil described earlier of CEOs overestimating how things are going for their foundation, just as research shows that we do when it comes to judging our driving skills, or our parenting, or our own job performance? Or is there something else going on here? Because that numerical difference between the 45% who strongly agree that their foundation has made progress and the 14% who believe foundations have made progress, that's a pretty large numerical difference. Could this be more about a lack of communication? We asked CEOs the extent to which they believe foundations do a good job publicly sharing what has not been successful in their experiences. only 23% of CEOs believe foundations are doing a good job communicating about this information. And maybe foundations aren't only missing the boat when it comes to communicating about what's not working. Maybe they're also not communicating well about what is working. Communication or lack of communication about success or lack of success might even be getting in the way of how well CEOs can even judge progress. Earlier, I mentioned CEOs' not so positive assessment of the collective progress that's been made. It turns out that 54% of CEOs aren't even all that confident in their assessment of the collective progress that's been made. That's the collective progress being made toward the same key goal as their foundation is working toward. CEOs say they'd be better able to assess collective progress if there were improved communication across the various organizations working toward the same key goal as they are. If there were more evidence-based information about what does and does not work. And if there were greater consistency in the metrics and indicators being used to measure progress toward the goal. CEOs do believe foundations have a role to play here. 57% believe foundations should be providing more funding to increase the availability of evidence about what works. So what's the story being revealed by all of these numbers? What we don't see is a harsh self-critique by CEOs, which is one of the hypotheses that Phil mentioned at the outset. The pattern we see in the data is one of CEOs feeling quite positively about how things are going at their foundations, and less positively about how things are going for others and for progress in general. Is this a case of positive illusions? Perhaps CEOs who are heavily invested in the success of their organizations and by the power dynamics inherent in their role are less likely to be surrounded by people who are comfortable disagreeing with them, are particularly susceptible to this. If this is the right interpretation, then perhaps CEOs would benefit from turning the critical eye they have about other foundations to their own foundation, asking tough questions about whether they're being as effective as they can be or need to be. Or is a lack of communication to blame? Perhaps foundations are doing more good work and making more progress than their peers realize, that the leaders of those foundations know it, but they're not communicating about it in ways that enable others to learn from their experiences or even to be aware of their experiences. Or perhaps the correct interpretation is somewhere in between, a combination of these two. That CEOs tend to overestimate how things are going for their foundation and underestimate what they might do differently, but that there is also a lack of communication about learnings and successes. Why does any of this even matter? The work foundations are doing is too important for CEOs not to have as thorough and as accurate an understanding as possible of the progress being made on issues toward which their foundations are devoting resources. If foundations aren't aware of what has worked, and if they might be following paths that others have already realized do not work, then are they being as effective as they can be? And are they making as much progress as they could be? Over the next day and a half, there'll be many opportunities to discuss these issues and these questions with colleagues, and to learn from colleagues' experiences with what they've tried through influencing policy, or through impact investing, or how others are working to get the best out of their staff. And we'll start right now with Phil, introducing a panel of CEOs who are focusing some of their efforts right here in Detroit.